Imagine waking up one morning, hearing that your country has declared war, and before you even finish breakfast, the war is already over. No long battles, no drawn-out strategies, no years of destruction, just 38 minutes. It sounds impossible, but in 1896, a war between two nations ended faster than most movies. And yet, despite its absurdly short duration, it changed the course of history, exposed the brutal reality of imperial power, and left behind lessons that still echo today. This is the story of the Anglo-Zanzibar War, the shortest war ever recorded. To understand how a war could last less than an hour, we need to step into the late 19th century, an era dominated by European imperialism. Zanzibar, a small island off the coast of East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, was not just any territory. It was a strategic hub for trade, especially spices, and, tragically, slaves. Because of its location, it became a valuable prize for global powers. By the late 1800s, Britain had established strong influence over Zanzibar, effectively turning it into a protectorate. This meant the Sultan ruled, but only with British approval. And that's where the problem began. To understand how a war could last less than an hour, we need to step into the late 19th century, an era dominated by European imperialism. Zanzibar, a small island off the coast of East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, was not just any territory. It was a strategic hub for trade, especially spices, and, tragically, slaves. Because of its location, it became a valuable prize for global powers. By the late 1800s, Britain had established strong influence over Zanzibar, effectively turning it into a protectorate. This meant the Sultan ruled, but only with British approval. And that's where the problem began. The British response was swift and uncompromising. They refused to recognize Khalid as Sultan and instead supported another candidate, Hamad bin Muhammad, someone more aligned with their interests. Then came the ultimatum. Britain gave Khalid a clear order: step down immediately or face war. The deadline? 9 a.m. on August 27, 1896. No negotiations, no extensions. Khalid, however, believed he could resist. Khalid wasn't entirely powerless. He gathered around 2,800 men, including palace guards and civilians. He fortified the palace and even had artillery and a royal yacht, the HHS Glasgow, armed for defense. He likely assumed the British wouldn't actually attack, or if they did, that Zanzibar could hold out long enough for negotiation. That assumption would prove disastrous. By the morning of August 27th, British naval forces had assembled in Zanzibar's harbor. Their fleet included powerful warships such as HMS St. George, HMS Philomel, HMS Raccoon. These weren't symbolic threats. These were heavily armed ships capable of devastating bombardment. Facing them, a palace and a small, underprepared force. Still, Khalid refused to surrender. As the clock ticked toward 9 a.m., tension filled the air. British officials sent final warnings. Khalid stood his ground. At exactly 9 a.m., the ultimatum expired. And at 9:02 a.m., the British opened fire. What followed was not a prolonged battle, it was overwhelming force. British ships unleashed a barrage of artillery on the palace. Within minutes, the palace began to collapse. Fires broke out across the structure. Zanzibar's artillery was silenced almost instantly. The royal yacht, Glasgow, attempted to fight back, but was quickly sunk. Khalid's forces were no match for British firepower. By 9:40 a.m., the war was over. Total duration, 38 minutes. Despite its short duration, the war was far from harmless. Around 500 Zanzibari soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded. The British suffered only one minor injury. The imbalance was staggering. This wasn't just a short war. It was a demonstration of overwhelming technological and military superiority. Khalid bin Barghash didn't stay to fight until the end. As the palace was being destroyed, he fled to the German consulate nearby. This created a new diplomatic issue. The British wanted him captured, but the Germans refused to hand him over. Eventually, Khalid escaped to German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, where he lived in exile. With Khalid gone, the British installed their chosen ruler, Hamad bin Muhammad. He ruled under British supervision and followed their directives closely. One of the first major changes? The abolition of slavery in Zanzibar, something Britain had long pushed for. So while the war itself was brief, its consequences were significant. At first glance, the Anglo-Zanzibar War might seem like a strange historical footnote, an almost absurdly short conflict. But it reveals much deeper truths. 1. The reality of imperial power. This war showed how European empires could impose their will on smaller nations almost instantly. Zanzibar didn't stand a chance. 2. Technology decides wars. The gap between British naval artillery and Zanzibar's defenses was enormous. This wasn't just a fight, it was a mismatch. 3. Political control disguised as protection. Zanzibar was technically independent, but in reality, Britain controlled its leadership. The war made that painfully clear. Imagine being a citizen of Zanzibar that day. You wake up to political tension. You hear rumors of war. Then suddenly, explosions. And before you can even process what's happening, it's over. The speed of the conflict likely made it even more shocking and terrifying. Even today, the idea of a war lasting only 38 minutes feels almost unbelievable. Most wars we learn about, last year's, involve multiple battles, have complex strategies. But this one, it was decided in less time than a school class. And yet, it changed leadership, reshaped politics, and reinforced colonial dominance. This event teaches us something important. War isn't always long to be impactful. Sometimes, the shortest conflicts reveal the clearest truths about power, inequality, and control. It also reminds us that history isn't just about the biggest wars, but also the strangest ones. Now, let's pause for a moment and imagine something different. What if Khalid had won? It sounds unlikely, almost impossible, given the imbalance of power. But history is often shaped by moments of unpredictability. If Zanzibar had somehow resisted the British fleet, even for a few days, the consequences could have been massive. First, it would have shattered the image of British invincibility. At the height of imperial power, Britain's dominance relied not only on military strength, but also on perception. If a small island nation could resist them, it might have inspired other colonies to question British authority. Second, it could have triggered greater involvement from rival European powers, especially Germany. At the time, Germany controlled nearby territories in East Africa. If the conflict had escalated, Zanzibar might have become a flashpoint for a much larger geopolitical struggle. And third, Zanzibar might have retained greater independence, at least temporarily. Khalid, despite his defiance, represented a rejection of foreign control. A prolonged conflict could have forced Britain into negotiation instead of immediate domination. But that's not what happened. Reality, as always, was far less forgiving. It's easy to reduce the Anglo-Zanzibar War to numbers and timelines. 38 minutes, 500 casualties, 1 injured British sailor. But behind those numbers were real people. Soldiers who barely had time to understand what was happening. Civilians caught in the chaos of bombardment. Families who lost loved ones in less than an hour. For many in Zanzibar, the war wasn't short. It was sudden, violent, and devastating. Imagine hearing the first cannon blast, not knowing if it's the beginning of something long or the end of everything. There was no time to prepare, no time to escape, no time to process fear, just impact. You might be wondering, if this is the shortest war in history, why don't more people know about it? The answer lies in how history is told. Most historical narratives focus on large-scale wars, long conflicts, major global consequences. The Anglo-Zanzibar War doesn't fit neatly into that mold. It was too short to develop complex battle strategies, too one-sided to be seen as a fair fight, and too overshadowed by larger imperial conflicts happening at the time. In a way, its simplicity is what makes it easy to overlook. But that simplicity is also what makes it so powerful. Because in just 38 minutes, it reveals the raw mechanics of empire, stripped of illusion. Let's talk about something crucial: technology. By 1896, the British Empire had access to advanced naval weaponry, including rapid-fire artillery, steel warships, highly trained naval crews. Zanzibar, on the other hand, had outdated cannons, limited training, minimal coordination. This wasn't just a gap, it was a chasm. The outcome of the war wasn't decided at 9:02 a.m. when the first shot was fired. It was decided years earlier through industrialization, military investment, and global expansion. In many ways, the Anglo-Zanzibar War is a perfect example of how technological superiority can compress war into minutes instead of years. Beyond the battle itself, this war symbolizes something deeper. Zanzibar was technically independent. It had a sultan. It had a government. It had its own identity. But when its leader made a decision without British approval, the response was immediate and overwhelming. That raises an uncomfortable question. Was Zanzibar ever truly independent? The war suggests the answer is no. After the war, British influence in Zanzibar became even stronger. With Hamad bin Muhammad as Sultan, the island followed British directives more closely than ever. One of the most significant changes was the end of slavery in Zanzibar. This is an important and complex point. On one hand, Britain's pressure helped end a brutal system. On the other hand, it came through domination and force. History is rarely simple. The same empire that imposed control also enforced reform. And the same war that crushed resistance also led to societal change. Today, the Anglo-Zanzibar War is often remembered as a historical curiosity, a strange record in the timeline of conflict. But its legacy goes beyond trivia. It challenges how we think about war. It forces us to reconsider. Does duration define importance? Can something brief still be deeply impactful? And how many other small events in history have shaped the world in unseen ways? There's something almost unsettling about how quickly everything happened. A political disagreement, an ultimatum, a refusal, and then destruction in under an hour. It shows how fragile peace can be, especially when power is unequal. In modern times, with far more advanced weapons, conflicts could unfold even faster. The Anglo-Zanzibar War, in a strange way, feels like an early glimpse into that possibility. Let's return to the final minutes of the war. The palace is burning. Smoke fills the sky. Cannons roar from the harbor. Inside, chaos. Orders are shouted, then lost in the noise. Walls collapse. Men scramble to survive. And somewhere in that chaos, Khalid makes a decision. He runs. Not out of cowardice, necessarily, but out of survival. Because by that point, the war is already lost. 9:40 a.m., the guns stop. The smoke lingers. And then silence. No cheering crowds. No dramatic victory speeches. Just the aftermath. Debris. Bodies. A shattered palace. And a new reality. You might think this is just a story from over a century ago, but its themes are timeless. Power versus resistance. Technology versus tradition. Control versus independence. These dynamics still exist today, just in different forms. The Anglo-Zanzibar War may be the shortest war in history, but its message is long-lasting. To truly understand the Anglo-Zanzibar War, we need to zoom out, far beyond the island itself. The year is 1896. The world is not as we know it today. Much of the globe is not divided into independent nations, but controlled, directly or indirectly, by powerful empires. At the center of this system stands one dominant force, the British Empire. At its peak, it controlled nearly a quarter of the Earth's land surface and population. Its influence stretched from India to Africa, from the Caribbean to the Pacific. There was even a phrase people used, the empire on which the sun never sets. And that wasn't just poetic exaggeration. It meant that somewhere in the world, at any given moment, the British flag was flying under daylight. Zanzibar's story is deeply connected to one of the most intense geopolitical races in history, the scramble for Africa. In the late 19th century, European powers competed aggressively to claim African territory. Britain, Germany, France, Belgium, and Portugal carved up the continent with little regard for local populations. Borders were drawn not by culture or history, but by negotiation tables in Europe. And Zanzibar? It sat at a strategic crossroads, an island rich in trade, located along key shipping routes in the Indian Ocean. It was too valuable to ignore. Before British domination, Zanzibar was not weak or insignificant. In fact, it was a thriving center of commerce. Under earlier rulers, especially Sultan Said bin Sultan, Zanzibar became one of the most important trading hubs in East Africa. It exported cloves, a highly valuable spice at the time, ivory, and tragically, slaves. Arab, Persian, Indian, and African influences blended into a unique cultural identity. Stone Town, the island's capital, became a bustling city filled with merchants, traders, and diplomats. This was not a forgotten island. It was a node in a global network. But as European influence expanded, Zanzibar's independence began to erode. Through treaties, pressure, and strategic alliances, Britain gradually increased its control over the island. They didn't immediately conquer it. Instead, they used a more subtle approach. Influence first, control later. By the late 1800s, Zanzibar was officially a British protectorate. This meant the Sultan still ruled, but Britain had final authority in key decisions, especially regarding foreign policy and succession. In other words, Zanzibar looked independent, but wasn't. In Zanzibar, the Sultan wasn't just a political leader. He was a symbol of continuity, identity, and authority. So when Sultan Hamad bin Thawani died, it wasn't just a leadership change. It was a moment of vulnerability, a moment where power could shift dramatically. And Khalid bin Barghash saw his opportunity. Who was Khalid? He wasn't an outsider. He was part of the royal family, ambitious, bold, and, as events would show, willing to challenge British authority. Some historians believe Khalid had long desired the throne and had even attempted to seize power before. But this time, he moved quickly. Too quickly. Instead of negotiating with the British or securing their approval, he acted decisively. He declared himself Sultan, occupied the palace, and prepared for resistance. Khalid's biggest mistake wasn't ambition. It was miscalculation. He underestimated Britain's willingness to act and overestimated his own ability to resist. Perhaps he believed the British would hesitate. Perhaps he thought diplomacy would prevail. Or perhaps he simply had no other choice. But by refusing to step down, he crossed a line that the British Empire could not ignore. From Britain's point of view, this wasn't just about Zanzibar. It was about maintaining control. If Khalid succeeded without consequences, it could send a dangerous message. That British authority could be challenged. And in an empire built on perception, that was unacceptable. So the response had to be immediate, decisive, overwhelming, not just to win the conflict, but to prevent future ones. Before the guns fired, there was still a chance, however small, to avoid war. British officials attempted negotiation. They sent messages, issued warnings, even gave Khalid time to reconsider. But every minute that passed brought them closer to the deadline. And Khalid never backed down. One of the most fascinating aspects of this war is how compressed everything was. Modern conflicts often involve months of buildup, years of tension, long negotiations. But here, the timeline was brutally short. Death of the Sultan's seizure of power, ultimatum, war. All within days. This intense compression created a situation where decisions had to be made quickly, mistakes had immediate consequences, and there was little room for strategy. Imagine the night of August 26, 1896. The air heavy with tension. British warships anchored in the harbor, their silhouettes visible under moonlight. Inside the palace, Khalid's forces prepare. Weapons are distributed. Positions are assigned. Nervous energy fills the halls. No one knows what tomorrow will bring, but everyone knows something is coming. Ultimatums are powerful tools. They force a decision, submit, or face consequences. But they also create a psychological trap. For Khalid, stepping down would mean losing power, losing face, possibly losing his future. So even if surrender was the logical choice, it may have felt impossible. As dawn breaks on August 27th, Everything is set. The British are ready. The ships are in position. The guns are loaded. And the clock is ticking. 8:30 a.m. 8:45 a.m. 8:59 a.m. Each second builds tension. Then the hour arrives. 9 a.m. The deadline passes. There is no surrender. At 9:02 a.m., the British open fire. And in that instant, history is made. Not because of the scale of the war, but because of its speed. The bombardment was precise and devastating. British gunners targeted the palace, artillery positions, defensive structures. Zanzibar's forces attempted to respond, but coordination quickly broke down. Communication failed, defenses crumbled, and within minutes, it became clear. This was not a battle. It was a collapse. One of the most destructive elements of the attack was fire. The palace, made partly of wood, was highly vulnerable. Once flames spread, they became uncontrollable. Fire doesn't just destroy structures. It creates chaos. Smoke blinds. Heat disorients. Panic spreads. And in that environment, organized resistance becomes nearly impossible. The royal yacht, HHS Glasgow, represents one of the most symbolic moments of the war. It was Zanzibar's most modern naval asset, a symbol of pride. But against British warships, it stood no chance. When it was hit and sank, it signaled something deeper. The end of resistance. By 9:30 a.m., the outcome is no longer in doubt. By 9:40 a.m., the guns fall silent. 38 minutes. That's all it took. What makes this story so compelling is not just its brevity, but its clarity. In less than an hour, we see the power of empire, the consequences of defiance, the role of technology, and the fragility of independence. When the guns fell silent at 9:40 a.m., Zanzibar was no longer the same. The palace, once a symbol of royal authority, was reduced to ruins. Smoke still lingered in the air. The sound of destruction had stopped, but its presence remained everywhere. What followed wasn't celebration. It was occupation. British forces moved quickly to secure control. There was no power vacuum, because they had already prepared for this outcome. And almost immediately, a new chapter began. Within hours of the war ending, Britain installed their chosen ruler, Hamad bin Mohammed. Unlike Khalid, Hamad was cooperative. He understood the political reality, that survival meant alignment with British interests. But this wasn't simply a change of leadership. It was the transformation of Zanzibar into something even more controlled than before. The Sultan still existed, but now his authority was undeniably limited. He ruled, but under watched out on paper, Zanzibar remained a sultanate. It had a ruler, it had a government, it had structure, but in reality, the British were in control. Key decisions, especially those involving foreign relations, trade, and internal reforms, were influenced or dictated by British officials. This created a dual system. Visible power, the Sultan. Actual power, the British Empire. And after the war, that distinction became impossible to ignore. One of the most significant changes under Hamad's rule was the abolition of slavery. This was something Britain had long pushed for. Zanzibar had been one of the last major centers of the East African slave trade. Ending it was seen by Britain as both a moral mission and a political goal. Under pressure, Hamad issued a decree to abolish slavery in 1897. At first glance, this seems like a positive outcome. And in many ways, it was. Thousands of people were freed from a brutal system. But the way it happened is important. It didn't come from internal reform. It came after military domination. This raises a deeper question. Can change imposed by force still be considered progress? History doesn't give simple answers. Meanwhile, the man who sparked the war, Khalid, had escaped. After fleeing the palace, he took refuge in the German consulate. This turned a local conflict into a diplomatic issue. Britain demanded his surrender. Germany refused. At the time, Germany and Britain were both competing for influence in East Africa. Protecting Khalid was not just an act of defiance. It was a strategic move. Eventually, Khalid was smuggled out and taken to German East Africa. There, he lived in exile. Years later, during World War I, British forces captured him and sent him into further exile, far from the throne he once claimed. His story didn't end in glory. It ended in displacement. Even though the war lasted only 38 minutes, its message traveled far beyond Zanzibar. Other rulers, other territories, other colonies, they all saw what happened. And the message was clear. Defiance would be crushed. Quickly, decisively, publicly. This wasn't just a military action. It was a demonstration. A warning. Zanzibar's story is also tied to a larger geopolitical tension, the rivalry between Britain and Germany. At the time, Germany controlled mainland territories in East Africa, while Britain dominated key coastal and strategic regions. Zanzibar sat between these spheres of influence. When Khalid took refuge in the German consulate, it highlighted just how fragile the balance was. If Germany had chosen to intervene more aggressively, the situation could have escalated. The 38-minute war might have become something far larger. But both sides avoided direct confrontation. For now, in the years that followed, Zanzibar remained under British control. The Sultanate continued, but its independence was largely symbolic. Gradually, the island became more integrated into the British colonial system. Economically, politically, and socially, its direction was shaped from outside. It wouldn't be until the mid-20th century that Zanzibar began moving toward true independence. And even then, its path would be complex and turbulent. Before the war, British influence in Zanzibar was strong, but not absolute. After the war, it was unquestionable. The Anglo-Zanzibar War didn't just remove one ruler. It removed the illusion of autonomy. One of the most striking lessons from this event is the illusion of choice. Khalid had a decision: step down or resist. But in reality, was that truly a choice? Given the imbalance of power, resistance almost guaranteed defeat. Yet surrender meant giving up everything. This is a dilemma that has appeared throughout history, especially in colonial contexts. When power is unequal, even choices become constrained. Most wars are remembered for their duration. Years, decades, generations. But this war is remembered for its speed. And that speed tells us something important. When one side holds overwhelming advantage, war doesn't need time. It becomes an event, not a process. Even today, the dynamics seen in the Anglo-Zanzibar War still exist in different forms. Not always as direct military conflict, but through economic pressure, political influence, strategic dominance. Power imbalances haven't disappeared. They've evolved. And in some cases, conflicts can still be decided quickly, not because they are simple, but because the outcome is already determined. When people hear about the shortest war in history, it often sounds like trivia, a strange fact, a curiosity. But behind that record is a deeper story, a story of empire, resistance, miscalculation, and control. Instead of asking, what's the shortest war in history? Maybe the better question is, what does the shortest war reveal about power? Because in those 38 minutes, we see something rare. A conflict stripped down to its essence. No prolonged campaigns. No shifting fronts. No drawn-out negotiations. Just decision and consequence. For the people of Zanzibar, the war didn't end at 9:40 a.m. That was just the beginning of living with its consequences. Loss, change, control. The physical destruction could be rebuilt, but the political reality was harder to undo. Even now, more than a century later, the idea still feels surreal. A war shorter than a movie. A conflict decided in minutes. And yet, completely real. Documented. Recorded. Undeniable. So the next time you think about war, you might imagine trenches stretching across continents. Armies clashing for years. Histories written over generations. But sometimes, history moves faster. Sometimes, it takes just one decision. One refusal. One moment of defiance. To trigger something unstoppable. The Anglo-Zanzibar War lasted only 38 minutes. Less than an hour. But in that short window, it revealed the true nature of power in its rawest form. No illusions. No balance. No second chances. Just overwhelming force. and irreversible change. Because in the end, it wasn't just the shortest war in history. It was one of the clearest,